From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Trump signing an executive action to direct federal agencies to work with Elon Musk's DOGE to reduce their workforces, saying he will seek congressional approval on cuts if needed.
This after Trump's meeting with the King of Jordan at the White House, with Abdullah agreeing to accept 2006 children from Gaza, but staying mum on Trump's redevelopment plans. We'll get reaction from former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, James Jeffery.
And Fed Chair Jay Powell telling the Senate Banking Committee in day one of testimony he's in no rush to lower rates, fielding questions about Trump administration policy and the dismantling of the CFPB. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren, the committee's ranking member, will join us with more.
Thanks for being with us on this Tuesday evening, and we begin with what took place in the last hour. Elon Musk joining President Trump during his executive order signing in the Oval, ordering the federal agencies to work with DOGE to trim their workforces. Musk spoke about the efficiency group's findings so far and defended his approach, that the president did note Congress may have a role to play.
We're finding tremendous fraud and tremendous abuse. If I need a vote of Congress to find fraud and abuse, it's fine with me. I think we'll get the vote, although there'll be some people that wouldn't vote. And how could a judge want to hold us back from finding all of this fraud and finding all of this incompetence? Why would that happen? Why would even Congress want to do that? Now, Congress, if we do need a vote, I think we'd get a very easy vote.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Megan Scully. So, Megan, we once again come back to the questions of the roles of the different branches of government here. Have we seen any desire so far on the part of this Congress to keep the Department of Government Efficiency in check?
Certainly not from congressional Republicans who are in charge of both chambers. We've seen more or less a capitulation of their power of the purse. Today, House Speaker Mike Johnson even told reporters that he believes that the executive, that Trump, has some authority to move appropriations around and certainly to make some of these cuts unilaterally was the sense that he was sending. He actually said that the judiciary should kind of hold off, step back in issuing all of these orders that we've seen over the last few weeks, the judiciary being the only branch of government that is really trying to put the brakes on Musk and Trump's agenda here.
It's interesting. We had the buyout offer go out to federal employees. I don't know how many have accepted it at this point or did before another judge got involved in that case. But apparently it's a better deal to be fired. You'll have up to a year of severance in this case through workforce reduction than taking the buyout offer. So are we done with the initial offer here?
We'll see. There was always concerns. The government employee unions raised concerns about the buyout offer, whether it was legal, whether they would eventually get it. The reduction in force is different for each agency, for each employee, depending on how long they have been there. Certainly a lot of questions as individual members of the federal workforce weigh their decisions here and their future prospects, whether they're going to retire or not. This is, something that we're feeling here in the district, but only, less than half, I think it's about 20% of the federal workforce is actually in this area here in Washington. So the effects of this are reverberating across the country.
Federal workers leaving because of a snowstorm today around 2 p.m. I wonder how that jives with the whole stay in the office motif at the DOGE. Bloomberg's Megan Scully, thank you so much. While meeting King Abdullah today, President Trump was asked about how the U.S. plans to acquire Gaza.
We're not going to buy anything. We're going to have it, and we're going to keep it, and we're going to make sure that there's going to be peace, and there's not going to be any problem, and nobody's going to question it. And we're going to run it very properly, and eventually we'll have economic development at a very large scale, maybe the largest scale on that site.
Following their meeting there in the Oval Office, which was initially set to be closed to press, King Abdullah tweeting, "I reiterated Jordan's steadfast position against the displacement of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. This is the unified Arab position." Joining us now with more, Bloomberg's national security reporter Nick Wadhams. King Abdullah did agree to take in a couple of thousand sick Palestinian children. Will that be the extent of his cooperation here?
Well, President Trump certainly wants to find out. I mean, you did see the president back off a little bit. He said he didn't feel the need anymore to threaten Jordan and Egypt, which he had done in the last couple of days, threatening to pull all aid unless they participate in his plan. I mean, this is really going to put Jordan in between a rock and a hard place, because there is no way they're going to countenance a plan where the U.S. has boots on the ground in Gaza, or takes it, as the president said, or forces Palestinians to leave. But it's also not clear that there is a plan within the U.S. to do that beyond what the president is saying. There's no indication yet that this is filtering down and they're actually coming up with some sort of serious plan to do this. So right now it looks like Jordan has managed to find an off-ramp, and I suspect that what you'll see is the president continue to put pressure on the idea of, okay, maybe behind the scenes we don't ask Jordan to take all the Palestinians who remain in Gaza, but we are going to ask you to do more beyond those 2,000 children that they agreed to take.
And I do wonder what the role of the likes of Steve Witkoff, for example, the Middle East envoy, will be in these ongoing conversations. But he was otherwise occupied today, Nick, taking a private plane to Russia to pick up an American who's been in prison there since 2021, Mark Fogel. We learned from Donald Trump in the Oval Office about an hour ago that he could be at the White House at 10 p.m. this evening. Do we have a sense of what the administration had to give in order to get him home?
That is a great question. President Trump was asked that in the Oval Office spray with Elon Musk, and his response was not much, which could mean anything. I mean, but it is interesting, at least, that he said not much rather than nothing. I mean, what's clear is that Russia would not have done this without getting something in exchange. So it's going to be a big question. I mean, Trump had repeatedly criticized former President Joe Biden for doing exchanges, basically swaps, saying it only encouraged more hostage taking or Americans being put in prison. So it'll be a big test for his negotiating skills. I mean, and the other thing is Steve Witkoff's supposed to be the Middle East envoy. As you say, what's he doing in Russia? What we're seeing here is another indication of just Trump likes Witkoff. They're longtime friends. They've played golf together. He trusts him. He's going to have him do it. So it's possible that there was some exchange related to Syria or the Middle East, but so many details we don't know still.
All right, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, thank you so much. And just one final quick note on the Middle East. We just got a statement in from the Egyptian Foreign Ministry saying that Egypt will be preparing a comprehensive vision for Gaza rebuilding, and that the Gaza plan will ensure that Palestinians are not displaced. The story will continue to follow. Just as we followed today, testimony in the Senate from the Fed chair, Jay Powell, who said the central bank does not need to rush to adjust interest rates, again signaling officials will be patient before lowering borrowing costs further.
With our policy stance now significantly less restrictive than it had been, and the economy remaining strong, we do not need to be in a hurry to adjust our policy stance. We know that reducing policy restraint too fast or too much could hinder progress on inflation.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Michael McKee. So, Mike, consistency from Powell on that messaging, also consistency on him not wanting to get ahead of the policies of this administration.
And can you blame him after the news conference thingy we just saw? Jay Powell wanted to keep it low-key today, did not really want to send a message to the markets, let alone to Donald Trump. He basically repeated what he has been saying for some weeks and what pretty much everyone else on the Fed has been saying for some time now, that the economy is in good shape, growth is strong, the labor market is healthy, and while inflation is down, it's still a little bit above target. So let's just leave things as they are, and we can do that because of the strength of the economy.
So markets not pricing in, at least fully, a rate cut until September. Michael McKee, should Jay Powell just go on vacation till then?
Yeah. If he goes somewhere warm, I'll be happy to go with him. At this point, yes. We don't know what the president is going to do. It appears many people in the administration don't know what the president is going to do. So Jay Powell certainly can't know, and he doesn't have any way, nor do any of the economists at the Federal Reserve, a way of assessing what it will mean for the economy. So he wants to stay on the sidelines, and he really can't trade when they might raise rates or by how much, because at this point it's all up in the air. But Powell did say they would look at the data on whatever policies the president does have on the economy, rather than speculate and start moving policy around based on what they think might happen.
Well, Mike, looking at the data, I was surprised to hear the chairman talk today about the idea that inflation expectations are anchored in light of the University of Michigan sentiment data we got on Friday that showed a big spike in inflation expectations, due in part to the threat of tariffs from this administration. Just how tenuous is that anchoring he's talking about?
Well, it may be more tenuous than the impression he's trying to let on. Now, the Fed always says that they look at long-term expectations as a more reliable indicator of whether things have become unanchored. And the 5 to 10-year forecast in that Michigan survey did show no change. But we have seen in the markets lately, the longer-term break-evens start to rise significantly. So market people are starting to think that maybe inflation is going to be a bigger danger down the road. He didn't address that today, but it is something to keep an eye on.
Michael, it's great to have you in Washington. As always, day 2 of testimony tomorrow. With the help of Michael McKee, we'll have coverage here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And coming up, a deeper dive into that meeting between President Trump and the King of Jordan with James Jeffery, the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I believe we'll have a parcel of land in Jordan. I believe we'll have a parcel of land in Egypt. We may have someplace else, but I think when we finish our talks, we'll have a place where they're going to live very happily and very safely.
Is there a parcel of land in Jordan that you're willing to have Palestinians?
Well, I think what we said, I have to look at the best interests of my country. I believe that the president is looking forward to getting a group of us Arabs here to discuss the overall plan.
President Trump earlier today in the Oval Office with Jordan's King Abdullah when asked about plans to resettle more than 2 million Palestinians currently living in Gaza, which President Trump has promised to take over and redevelop. Joining us now is James Jeffery, the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey and chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. He also worked in the first Trump administration as a special presidential envoy, helping to lead the charge against ISIS. Mr. Ambassador, it's great to have you back. With your knowledge in the region and your experience working with Donald Trump, give us a reality check here. Clearly, our partners in the Middle East do not see a way forward on this plan. Is Donald Trump just opening a negotiation, or does he really think that developing Gaza and removing 2 million people is the answer?
First, thanks for having me on. What I learned in the last administration with President Trump is to not second guess him. He's very flexible. He also thinks outside of the box. Those are good traits. At times, he comes up with approaches that it's very hard to see how you would carry it out. The first question is, how do you get the 2 million people who, for ideological reasons, as well as the fact that this is all they've known, do not want to leave Gaza? Even though it's mainly rubble now. That's the first problem. The second one is the legal basis upon which we would take it. And the third one is, would Egypt and particularly Jordan take hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, which in the case of Jordan could be destabilizing to the entire regime, as the king gently pointed out by saying he has to take his own country's interests into account. But that said, President Trump is doing something else, I think, and that is to indicate that the ideas that I and others have had and put on the table and we're trying to execute if this ceasefire with Hamas actually is finally carried out, to rebuild Gaza, to have an international presence and all of that, that may not be realistic. Gaza is totally destroyed. It has presented a existential threat to the state of Israel, certainly on the 7th of October. And it may be that we need to think outside the box, whether that means the way Donald Trump is doing it or some other way, I don't know. But he deserves credit for at least raising the point that maybe going back to another round of rebuilding and then blowing up is not the way forward.
Well, Ambassador, you just mentioned the ceasefire that is still in place in Gaza right now. Of course, we're well into the 42-day period it's supposed to last before phase 2 would theoretically begin. Is this a realistic phase 2 proposal? What other conversations are happening as they try to see if there is a possibility of a more lasting peace?
Exactly. Leave aside the fact that Hamas has suddenly blocked further hostage releases. Let's assume that they take Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump seriously, and they start releasing hostages again by the deadline of Saturday. You still have the second phase of 42 more days, and then a third phase to actually complete the redevelopment, not the redevelopment of Gaza, but the introduction of a day after international presence. The problem is, and it was always in this agreement, it's not something new that the Israelis have demanded, it was there from the beginning in May. Right now, they're negotiating to see what Gaza will look like, who will govern it, what the role of Hamas will be, and the role of Israeli security if there is a final Israeli pullout in the return of all the hostages as the ceasefire calls for. It's not automatic. Hamas wanted it automatic. The Biden administration hinted that it should be automatic, but it never was. So if Hamas and Israel cannot agree on what Gaza over the long term will look like, there will not be a final ceasefire, there will not be a final Israeli withdrawal, and probably a return to fighting.
Based on what we heard from Donald Trump today, all hell will break out if hostages are not released by noon on Saturday. It seems like we could go in a couple of directions here, Ambassador, either indulging continued negotiations, working towards a ceasefire, or going back to fighting between Israel and Hamas, and potentially conducting a preemptive strike against Iran, which was reportedly something discussed between Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump last week, and we were told likely came up again today with King Abdullah of Jordan. Where are you on this idea of going after Iran's nuclear facilities now?
I take Donald Trump's repeated statements that he would prefer a negotiated solution for a reality. Now, it would be very hard, not impossible, but very hard for Israel to take out the entire Iranian nuclear infrastructure on its own. It would require a significant American action, and the question is, what would the legal basis for that be? If you're retaliating, as we've been doing with the Iranian attacks throughout the last year, Iranian attacks aimed at least in the general direction of U.S. forces, that's one thing. It's something very different to launch a major assault on another country. But the other thing is, I don't think it's necessary. I think the Iranians, however they play with the idea of a nuclear weapon, realize at this point that it is the end for them if they actually develop one. I think that we're in a different Middle East since the 7th of October. I think the Israeli dismantling of the Iranian air defense system and showing that Israel can operate without danger over Iran, and that means the Americans can sure as hell do it 10 times more, that Iran is in a position where if it goes for a nuclear weapon, it will be destroyed.
And still ahead here on Balance of Power, Bloomberg's conversation with the new Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, is up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from Washington. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. And earlier this afternoon, our colleagues Alex Steele and Scarlett Fu had the chance to speak with the new Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright. They discussed Trump's agenda, the future of the energy sector, but began with the Department of Government Efficiency's plans for his department.
I've met the DOGE team that's at Department of Energy and liked them a lot. These are passionate people that are coming in to looking very specifically right now at the flow of funds going out and the systems we use to carry out our basic business functions. How can we be smarter and more efficient doing what we do? And how can we be very careful to know where funds are flowing and where they're not flowing? So it's much less intrusive than a typical corporate audit, but it's giving quick, up-to-date information to help me and the rest of the department run more efficiently and be better stewards of the taxpayer funds.
The DOE was quick to say that there's no nuclear secrets being given away or anything along those lines, and I put that in quotes. But is there a circumstance where you would have to turn that over? Is that become aware of any of this at any point?
I've heard nothing about that at all. You know, we did security vetting on the small team that we have. They have read-only access to very limited parts of our systems. No one has asked or expressed any interest, and we would definitely not share the secrets of our nuclear weapons program and our nonproliferation and all those efforts. That's not part of DOGE. This is not a reckless effort. In fact, it's a very focused and thoughtful effort to quickly look for ways to improve how we run the business.
Right, to streamline things, make things more efficient. We understand the purpose there behind DOGE. So I guess the question for you, Mr. Secretary, is how lean can the DOE get then?
We don't know yet. We don't know yet. But if you take an organization that hasn't been carefully looked at, are we finding low-hanging fruit to reduce our expenditures and deliver the same output? I can say that's an unqualified yes, we are.
You can find Bloomberg's full conversation with the new Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, online or on the terminal. Kayleigh, really interesting, and a reminder there, of course, that the Energy Department, the Secretary of Energy, oversees our nuclear arsenal. Yep. This is incredibly sensitive information that he is now in control of. And when it comes to nuclear energy, a big question about whether this administration can follow through with some of the promises we heard on the campaign trail to unlock nuclear as one of the options that could help to power data centers. And you have Stargate in mind on that, too.
Yep. Artificial intelligence is a huge part of this picture. And the question is going to be to what extent the administration is relying, hopefully, on this deregulation effort and easing of permitting process and that kind of thing in order to jumpstart a lot of this. Chris Wright, of course, will be intimately involved in all of that as the deregulatory agenda broadly is pushed by this administration.
Yeah, that's for sure. Of course, we had our eyes on energy today with an important conversation surrounding the Middle East, and coming up, President Trump's meeting with King Abdullah of Jordan. Back on the table here on Balance of Power. We're going to take a look at what they discussed with our political panel. It's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Transparency is what builds trust, not simply somebody asserting trust. So not somebody saying they're trustworthy, but transparency, so you can see everything that's going on. And then you can see, am I doing something that benefits one of my companies or not? It's totally obvious.
And we thought that we would not let him do that segment or look in that area if we thought there was a lack of transparency or a conflict of interest.
The push and pull between Elon Musk and President Trump together in the Oval Office today, along with Elon's son, if you saw all the way down there on the corner of your screen. And EO this afternoon pointed at eliminating federal workers or downsizing the workforce. Joining us now this evening's political panel, Ashley Davis is here, Republican strategist, alongside Adam Hodge, Democratic strategist, managing director at Pulpit International. It's great to see you both, and thank you for being here. Can we just start with the optics on this? Elon Musk in a black overcoat with a black MAGA hat standing behind the president at the Resolute desk for this executive order. The press, by the way, was excused from the room before he ever got to sign anything. How is this playing optically for the American people?
I just want to look at this as if that was the Bush administration, we were like supposed to wear pantyhose still in the West Wing. And you know, Bush did like pantyhose, or not pantyhose, but he did like children. But I think, listen, it's a whole different world. And there are things that are being talked about that none of us would ever expect. But I just don't know. The president feels at the end of the day, this is what he was elected to do. And what we talked about yesterday, actually, was do all these things that he's doing help bring down egg prices or rent or anything else? And so I think that the reason that the CBS poll has him at 53% is that the long-term goal, because he is blowing stuff up, but is it impacting the everyday American's wallet? And I think that that's going to be the balance that he's going to need to show. Again, we're 3.5 weeks in. It feels like 3 years. I've aged 10. But I do feel that it's just a whole other dynamic. And the West Wing picture there is just very different than most of us are used to.
I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Obama got raked over the coals for wearing a tan suit to the briefing room, or the fact that Fox News went crazy about him not wearing a suit and tie on a Sunday, right? So
the mom
we are yeah. Well, she shouldn't have worn the jeans, but I'll critique him on that. But I think the reason why this DOGE thing is striking a record, a note with people around the country, is because of that transparency question that people aren't sure, why is this billionaire, with seems like there's no checks and balances on what he does, in charge of the Treasury payment system, or what foreign aid we're giving to people, or what is the staffing levels at the Department of Education. And just this week, that's why you saw 5 former secretaries of the U.S. Treasury, including my former boss, Jack Lew, raising concerns about the DOGE people in charge of the Treasury payment system. They may say all they want that they only have read-only access. But in many ways, they are already defaulting on the U.S. debt by not paying obligations that we've incurred. They are choosing to not pay government debt that we owe to suppliers, and that's a real red flag.
Well, as you raise checks and balances, Adam, there's obviously an ongoing conversation now about the role that Congress and the courts play in all of this. We heard about that today from the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, as well as Democratic Congressman Pete Aguilar, talking about the court's reaction specifically to Trump's agenda.
Of course, the branches have to respect our constitutional order, but there's a lot of game yet to be played. I think the courts should take a step back and allow these processes to play out. What we're doing is good and right for the American people.
They trust the court decision when they win. When they do not win, they want to burn it all down. That's the consistent theme of where the Republican Party is right now.
So when we consider the courts, which have dealt a number of blows to the efforts of the DOGE and this administration so far, from birthright citizenship to USAID and NIH funding, they are in some ways acting as a block right now. J.D. Vance doesn't like it. Some Republicans, including the House Speaker, are suggesting they should step back as well. But isn't that their role, Ashley?
It is, and I actually think that it's the Democrats' only ability to stop this right now. I mean, you have, and let's be honest, the people that are stopping, the judges that are stopping it, are Democrat, either appointed or elected. So it has become a political issue, which I didn't agree with under Biden as well, that this whole court system has become so political that my biggest concern is that it undermines the whole judiciary system in our United States. I do have to stick up right now for the Speaker. He is a constitutional lawyer, so I do think that he takes this a little bit more serious than others, no matter what his politics. But at the end of the day, if the American people continue to watch this political system politicizing what the court system's doing, I don't think that's positive for the U.S.
Elon Musk was not the only person in the Oval Office today. King Abdullah of Jordan was there as well. We were talking earlier with Ambassador Jeffery about this. Your thoughts on Donald Trump continuing to push this idea of displacing 2 million plus Palestinians, developing Gaza, and somehow getting the region on board? King Abdullah has to go home with this message to not only his people, but apparently a meeting in Saudi Arabia. How's this going to play?
I think it risks undermining all of President Trump's accomplishments with the Abraham Accords that he holds up as the hallmark deal in the Middle East. Let's not remember, his team was also part of the negotiations on the hostage deal. Like Steve Witkoff was alongside Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk at the end of the Biden administration to get this deal done. Now he's walking back on it. Yeah. And so it raises, again, another questions about, can you trust the deal that you strike with Donald Trump? And I think it risks really blowing up all the tense relationships and their ability to seal a bigger grand bargain in the Middle East with these people. I mean, you're talking about 2 million Gazans, trying to move them out of displacing them out of a country, out of an area that is their only home. Like, many people call that, that is a version of ethnic cleansing, by moving people out of their home. And so there's real questions about how that the other partners in the region will see that and react to it. And I think it poses real damage to the Trump administration's foreign policy in the region for them to be able to get this done.
Well, we should hear from the president about this in his own words. This is what he said in the Oval earlier with the King of Jordan at his side about his plans for the redevelopment of Gaza.
It's not a complex thing to do. And with the United States being in control of that piece of land, a fairly large piece of land, you can have stability in the Middle East for the first time. And the Palestinians, or the people that live now in Gaza, will be living beautifully in another location.
Ashley, we frequently question with this president in particular whether something is the opening of a negotiation or policy he really intends to pursue. How do you see this one?
I think this is a positioning, but I also think that what he has said, and I understand 100% what you're saying, but I also think that no one else has come up with any other solution. And you can't live in Gaza right now. How do you rebuild Gaza when it's been 100% destroyed? Obviously, there's all the different issues that go along with that. But also, the foreign aid that has been given to Gaza in the last 20 years have also been going to Hamas and the terrorists. So we have to strike some sort of balance to figure this out. And the problem is moving them means that they're going away from their homeland or whatever. But I mean, not whatever. I mean, it's very important. But I think that it's also the point of how do you rebuild it when it's completely destroyed?
But let's be clear, like, to protect and move those people and taking over, requires tens of thousands of U.S. troops to do that. Donald Trump, who says he's ended foreign wars, he's not have any intervention in the Middle East. So you can't do that without putting boots in the ground. So I'll believe that this is actually real if you see an order and there are tens of thousands of Marines going to help protect Gaza.
The White House has said they do not want to commit.
But again, this is why this strategy doesn't make any sense, because there's no actual plan.
And people don't want to move.
No, I mean, of course not. If this was you had 2 million people in the DMV and you say, you know what, you're all moving to North Carolina, and we said no, thank you. Like, the only way to do that is to forcibly move them, and that's not going to happen. Sure. And the other parties in the region, Saudi Arabia, the Qataris, the UAE, they're not going to be part of a plan that forcibly moves people because it breeds unrest in their own country.
But what's the solution? I mean, that's my question: is what is the solution? I mean, how do you fix it? How do you rebuild I mean, they're living horribly right now. It's a humanitarian issue is insane.
It is insane. I think one of the solutions is you provide corridors within the Gaza Strip, and you work with partners in Saudi Arabia and UAE to help finance reconstruction. Now, you have to do that with partners that you can trust, and there's reasons, you've raised good reasons why to have some skepticism about the organizations who've done that work in the past. But I think forcibly moving these people to another country has all the hallmarks of more tension and unrest in the region. I don't think it will succeed.
Well, we expect to hear from Egypt shortly on this. Yeah. You mentioned this earlier, Kaylee, a headline on the terminal. Egypt's foreign ministry saying it's preparing a comprehensive vision for Gaza rebuilding. If it's a regional effort, does that make you more comfortable?
It has to be a regional effort. I mean, there's no other way to solve this problem, but I think people have to approach it in good faith. Mm-hmm. And so that's where, again, I think people in Gaza, the people in Egypt, the Jordanians, have real questions like, if we strike this deal, can we trust that it will hold? Just a month ago, Donald Trump and his team helped negotiate a final ceasefire. And now he's going back on that and now saying maybe Netanyahu will just decide. I mean, that raises questions that are you going to keep up your end of the bargain? And so I think whether it's American dollars, taxpayer dollars, or American troops being part of that, that's a real problem that I think flies in the face of everything you've heard from Donald Trump about his foreign policy.
But I thought the reason that the deal was blowing up was because the hostages weren't being released. I mean, I think there is probably a give and take that you and I probably aren't privy to right now, right? We maybe used to be. But it's kind of our problem. Yeah.
Well, it was not a problem to have you two here for this discussion today. This was fantastic. Ashley Davis and Adam Hodge, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much. And still ahead, the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, will join us with reaction to Fed Chair Jay Powell's testimony before her and her colleagues today and what's happening with the CFPB. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
If the CFPB is not there examining these giant banks to make sure they are following the laws on not cheating consumers, who is doing that job?
I can say no other federal regulator.
That was Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts pressing Fed Chair Jerome Powell during his Senate hearing today about the CFPB. And joining us now for more live from Capitol Hill is Senator Warren, who, of course, is ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee. Senator, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We do have many questions for you about what's happening with the CFPB specifically. But we also saw today, as you and your colleagues pressed the chairman repeatedly about the influence this administration's policies, like tariffs, are going to have on monetary policy. When we are considering policies that could potentially be inflationary, do you see justification here for the Fed to even be thinking about cutting rates?
So look, I press the Fed to lower interest rates because I want families to be able to have cheaper mortgages and to be able to pay off their credit card debts. But I truly understand the hesitancy that the Fed chair expressed today because we live in a world of on-again, off-again tariffs that Donald Trump has put in place and taken out of place. Donald Trump's on-again, off-again firing tens of thousands of federal workers. His on-again, off-again, whether or not we're going to have federal contracts honored to sell wheat and other commodities to the federal government for purposes of international aid, whether or not the financial cops are going to stay on the beat, or are people just, now is it open season on cheating consumers? Look, Donald Trump needs to settle down and focus on what he ran for president on, and that is lowering costs for American families. That's where he needs to keep his attention, and that will put the Fed in a much better place to lower interest rates.
Well, Kayleigh already mentioned the CFPB, Senator, so let's talk about consumers for a moment. This is obviously something that's very important to you, and we got into it with Mick Mulvaney yesterday, former acting White House chief of staff who spent some time at that agency, and what he had to say about the double-edged sword of how the CFPB is funded. Let's listen.
Liz Warren created this agency when she was a Harvard professor. She dreamt up the idea. She wanted something in her mind that was above politics. Consumer protection in her mind was too important to trust to elected officials. The double-edged sword of that is that when Rohit Chopra is running the place and Congress wants to shut them down, he can sort of go and get his money without having to worry about what Congress thinks. But the other side of the sword is if Russ Vought is running the place and he doesn't want to draw any money down from the Fed, he doesn't have to.
When you consider that funding mechanism, Senator, did you Trump-proof the CFPB enough to withstand this period of time?
So, I hope you had a good time yesterday with Mick Mulvaney, but let's be clear. The CFPB is funded in the largest sense just like every other bank regulator. Starting back in 1863 with our very first bank regulator, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, Congress said we cannot fund the banking regulators through the appropriations process and expect them to still do their jobs. Even in 1863, they were so afraid that those big financial institutions would come in and influence Congress to cut back, for example, on the money to enforce the legal regulations. And so all of the agencies that are the banking regulators have been funded outside the political process. And by the way, Mick Mulvaney, the Republicans, some of the giant banks have already argued all the way to the United States Supreme Court and back again that that kind of funding is not right. And the United States Supreme Court said it's fine. Congress has done it in many other circumstances. They can continue to do it. But you know what this is really about, and where we are right now is about sidelining the cops, the financial cops. Right now, we have no one who is enforcing the consumer financial protection laws anywhere in our federal government on the big banks and the non-bank financial institutions. That's what Chair Powell said today. And that's a real problem for every American who has a credit card, a mortgage, a payday loan, a car loan, a student loan. Right now, Donald Trump, Elon Musk have just declared open season on every consumer in America.
Well, what about open season on the financial regulators? As we talk about those that have similar funding structures to the CFPB, Senator, where are you concerned they'll target next?
Look, if the Republicans want to change the funding mechanism for the CFPB, they've got the majority in the House and the Senate. Let them come over here and try to do that. Don't make an end run that is clearly illegal by letting Elon Musk shut down the agency effectively. Come over here to Congress. Congress created the CFPB and the other regulators, and Congress is the only one that can shut them down. You might ask yourself, though, since they're in control, why haven't they done that? And I'll tell you the reason why. It's because the CFPB is very popular. And it's not just popular among Democrats, it's popular among Republicans and independents, because nobody likes getting cheated by a giant bank. Nobody likes getting scammed on their car loan. Nobody likes financial institutions taking advantage of consumers, and the CFPB is the one agency on the side of consumers.
I don't know if you had your eyes, Senator, on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue a little while ago, but Elon Musk himself, who I believe you referred to as the co-president in your opening remarks today in the committee, joined President Trump, who was sitting behind the Resolute desk, Elon Musk in a black overcoat, talking about the effort here and the work that's being done by DOGE. Let's listen quickly to what he said.
What meaning does democracy actually have? If the people cannot vote and have their will be decided by their elected representatives in the form of the president and the Senate and the House, then we don't live in a democracy. We live in a bureaucracy. So it's incredibly important that we close that feedback loop, we fix that feedback loop, and that the public's elected representatives, the president, the House, and the Senate, decide what happens, as opposed to a large, unelected bureaucracy.
Senator Warren, is there any chance this could work?
I have no idea what Elon Musk is trying to say here. Does he not actually understand how government works? Or is he just trying to blow more smoke here? Look, if Congress wanted to shut down the CFPB, they have the power to do it, just like they have the power to shut out any other agency in government. That is the power allocated to Congress. It is not the power allocated to Elon Musk. Nobody voted for him, and even if they had, nobody at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue has the right to shut down an agency and not spend the money and do the work that Congress has actually empowered it to do.
So is Congress, and specifically your party within it as the minority, Senator, is the only real recourse you have here to act against what the Department of Government Efficiency and this administration is doing to shut down the government next month?
You know, I listen to the premise of your question. No, when people in the administration are violating the law, we have a lot of recourse. Starts out with a whole bunch of lawsuits that are out there right now against them. And if those lawsuits correctly determine that they are breaking the law, they got to stop. That means they have to restart the payments. That means they have to put the financial cops back on the beat. That means they have to go ahead and continue the government contracts as the law requires. This is how government works. 3 equal branches of government. And right now, in the courts, there's litigation over what the administration, what Elon Musk has done. When he's found to have violated the law, he's supposed to get in compliance with the law. This is not a problem we need to fix later. This is a problem right now. When we have got Elon Musk and his little band of hackers in our financial system illegally, then we need to get them out.
Well, Senator, I think Kayleigh was maybe referring to a couple of senators from New Jersey who suggested that a government shutdown may be one of the only ways to put pressure on this situation. That was a conversation on Sunday morning television. But as we talk today on Bloomberg TV and radio, I wonder your thoughts on some concerns that if there were, in fact, a shutdown, no matter whose fault it is, some of these departments might not ever reopen when there was a deal to fund the government because of the efforts of DOGE. Do you see it that way?
Look, I appreciate that you framed the question the way you have. Let's understand, Donald Trump is already shutting the government down by letting Elon Musk move in against USAID. He's shutting down the government by letting them move against the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and firing the financial cops. He's shutting the government by reneging on millions of federal contracts. He's shutting down part of the government. Shoot, he's shutting down the government that promised to help fund child care centers and places that are trying to help vets find housing. Donald Trump, through his co-president, Elon Musk, is in the business of trying to shut down the government right now and doing so illegally. That's why we're in the courts. That's why we need to solve this problem. Not weeks from now. We need to solve it right now because people are getting hurt right now.
Well, stay close with us on this, Senator. We have a lot to learn still, and your insights are important to us on Bloomberg. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, that's the ranking member, of course, on the Senate Banking Committee. We thank you for being with us. That also reminds us, Kayleigh, that there's a second day of testimony ahead for Jay Powell tomorrow.
Yep, he'll be in the House, and we'll have it fully covered for you on Balance of Power, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Have a good evening, and stay safe out there in the snow.